we're going to look at 3 things in John 1 which powerfully demonstrate that Jesus is God. And after that, I'm going to share with you a question that you can ask Jehovah's Witnesses that they never have a good answer for. All right, so we're going to look at 3 major things in John 1. And these are things that I found that many people seem to overlook. Point number 1 is that Yahweh creates all things, yet we also see in John 1:1 that it's also the Logos who creates all things. Nehemiah 9:6, again, it's Yahweh who's the one who's created the heavens and the earth, and the angels are worshiping Yahweh. Now again, remember, as I pointed out in my previous video, there is only one creation event in Scripture. Only one creation event. Okay, there's one creation event, and there's one creator-creation distinction. Second point that we see in John's Gospel of John 1 is looking at John 1:3, which says in the Greek, oude eno yegonin. What does this mean? Not one thing came into existence. All right, let's just look at it here again in the Jehovah's Witnesses Kingdom Interlinear Translation. Okay, going to John 1:3. All things through him, referring to the Logos, referring to Jesus, all things through him came to be, and apart from him came to be not but one thing which has come to be. All right? All things by him began, and without him began not one thing that came to be or that came into existence. Not, so oude here actually means not. En means one. Not one thing came into existence. Now, the New World Translation, the English New World Translation, actually emphasizes this even more. Not even one thing came into existence. Now, the word even here is actually not even in the Greek, but for whatever reason, the Jehovah's Witnesses New World Translation emphasizes this point even more for us and says that all things came to existence through him, and apart from him, not even one thing came into existence. All right, so again, going back to the Jehovah's Witnesses idea that somehow Jesus is a created being, or he's the first creature that God made, and that through him he made everything else. Well, that simply cannot be the case. Otherwise, we'd have to conclude that John 1:3 is lying. Why is that? Well, because if Jesus was created and the realm he lives in was created, then that's 2 things that were created. That's 2 things that began without him. All right, so if the realm that Jesus must live in was created, and then Jesus is created to live in that realm, all right, so that's 2 things that would be existing without Jesus. All right, you cannot have 1 or 2 things existing without Jesus because, again, the text says, oude en oyegonin. Say it with me in Greek, oude en oyegonin. Not one thing came into existence without him. All right, so this is a very powerful clarification that we have in John 1:3. In fact, this necessarily implies that Jesus is eternal. All right, so not only do we see in John 1:1a that there's parallel language between John 1:1a and Genesis 1:1, which is clarified even more in Nehemiah 9:6, that Yahweh is the one who creates all things, yet we see here it's also the Logos who's creating all things. But we also furthermore see that Jesus is eternal in John 1:3, because without him was made not one thing that came into existence. All right, third point that I want to point out now. All right, we're going to see in John 1:1c that God's nature is the Logos' nature. So the Father's nature is the Logos' nature. God's nature is the Logos' nature. Why is that? How is that? All right, the reason this is the case, because John 1:1c says, and the Logos was God. All right, and the Logos was God. All right, so let's dissect this a little bit here. Let's look at the Greek here. All right, the Greek says in John 1:1c, ke theos ino logos. Ke theos ino logos. And God was the Logos. The full text says, in the beginning was the Logos was with God or towards the God, and God was the Logos. Now, Jehovah's Witnesses and non-Trinitarians are notorious for translating this passage as saying, and a God was the Logos. You can even go to the Jehovah's Witnesses website. You can type in John 1:1. They're going to have a plethora of explanations on here to dissuade you from any understanding, any type of Trinitarian understanding or interpretation. They're going to tell you that it's best translated as, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was a God. All right, so we can even see this in their English translation here, and the Word was a God, right? And so they're going to go through here and they're going to try to persuade you that there needs to be an indefinite article here, that there needs to be an indefinite article before theos, that because there's no definite article of the before theos, it does not say ho theos, that it's therefore supposed to then default to an indefinite article and say a God. All right, so if we were to word for word translate this into English, it would be, and God was the Logos. All right. Now, there's a reason that we would not translate it this way in English. Okay. The reason that we do not translate this as, and God was the Logos in English, but rather we translate it as, and the Logos was God in English, is because we have to look at what is the subject of the sentence. Okay. So, in the Greek, we can tell what is the subject because of what has a definite article in front of it. All right, a definite article like the. We're referring to a specific thing here. All right, so we're referring to the Logos. All right, so here we have the definite article ho before Logos. So we know that this is the subject. Logos is the subject here. Okay, so what then is the predicate of this phrase? The predicate would be theos. All right, so theos is the predicate. In English, we put the subject before the predicate. So we're going to put the Logos was God, right? So this is how we know this is the correct word order if we're going to translate this into English. All right, so now we're going to look at something very interesting going on with this phrase. What is it that's unusual about this? There's something that's actually unusual about this phrase. Well, what's unusual is that you have the word theos here instead of theon. Why is that? Usually, this would say theon because of the fact that this is the predicate, right? We just established that that God here is the predicate. So if God is the predicate, and here's the word God in the Greek is supposed to be the predicate, that would mean it would take on what's called the accusative case. So if something is in the predicate in Greek, it takes on a different case ending, which would be the accusative case. Okay, so theon would be the accusative case. We don't see that though. We see a different case ending in the Greek here, which is theos, which is actually the nominative case. The nominative case is actually refers to something as being the subject. So it's like, well, wait a second here. It's like we've got two subjects almost. It's like the Logos is a subject, and it's like the God is a subject as well. All right, so it's like saying here theos is a subject, and Logos is a subject. Now, it's almost looking at just the case endings, it would seem like there's two subjects because there's two nominative cases. Nevertheless, we would know that there's actually not two subjects because here we have a definite article, right? So because we have a definite article here, we know that Logos is actually the subject, and there's no article placed before theos, and so we would know that this is not the subject. Nevertheless, it's still unusual. If it's not a subject, why is it taking on a nominative case of theos as if it were a subject? There's a name for this when something takes on a nominative case but is actually the predicate of the sentence. It's called a predicate nominative, okay? I have it abbreviated here as PN, which simply just means the predicate nominative. All right, so what happens in the Greek? What does it mean? What does it indicate in the Greek when we have this predicate nominative? Well, I'm glad you asked. What it indicates is that it's telling us the nature of something. That's right. It's telling us the nature of something. All right, so what it's telling us is that the nature of God is the nature of the Logos. So the nature of God is the same as the nature of the Logos. All right? So it takes on a qualitative connection. It's not saying that the Logos is a God, and it's not saying that the Logos is the God in the sense of equating the Logos with the Father, because you can't equate the Logos with the Father because the Son cannot be the Father. The Son is distinct from the Father. But nevertheless, it's doing a third option. It's showing us the nature of the Logos. And what is the nature of the Logos? The nature of the Logos is the nature of God, the nature of the Father. Is this correct? Could this be an accurate translation? Are we talking crazy stuff here? Absolutely not. Let's go down just a little bit further in John 1, and we'll see this exact same thing happening again, to where John is going to use the predicate nominative in verse 14 in this same way. All right, so when we look at John 1:14, it says, "Ke o logos sarx egeneto," and the Word became flesh. Ke logos sarx egeneto, and the Word became flesh. All right, so can you tell me what is the subject in this sentence? You noticed it as well. It has the definite article o here. We know because it has the definite article that o logos, or the Word, is the subject in this sentence. And then sarx is going to be the predicate of the sentence. Flesh became, or as in English we would translate it as became flesh. All right, but notice again, sarx is also in the nominative case. So if it was in the accusative case, it would actually say sarka. All right, but we don't see it in the accusative case. We actually see it in the nominative case, sarx. All right, so again, why in the world do we see this pattern in John 1 to where he's using words in the predicate nominative? He's using words that are in the predicate, but instead of giving them their accusative case endings, which is usually the case with the predicate word, he's switching it and he's giving it a nominative case ending. Why in the world is John doing this? Well, it's not a coincidence and it's not an accident. John is purposely doing this because he's describing the nature of things that are very important in this passage. Let's look at it here. All right, so the Logos became the nature of flesh. Sarx means flesh. All right, so the Logos became the nature of flesh. The Logos became human. The Logos took on the nature of what human nature is. All right, so this is the question. This is the question that you can go ask non-Trinitarians, especially Jehovah's Witnesses. Ask them this question. In John 1:14, when John uses the predicate nominative to describe the nature of what the Logos became, did the Logos become a flesh, or did the Logos become the flesh? No. The obvious answer that they're going to squirm around is simply to just say no. No, he did not become either of those things. Okay then. Do you love consistency? Is a follow-up question you can give them. If the answer is yes, I love consistency, then let's be consistent together. Then if John 1:14 is not saying that the Logos became a flesh or the flesh, then why would it be any different with John 1:1c in saying that the Logos was a God or the God? It's neither. It's neither in John 1:14, it's neither in John 1:1c. Instead, what do we see in John 1:14? We see that the Logos became flesh by nature. So then to be consistent, what should we also then be concluding in John 1:1c? It's that the Logos was the nature of God as well. In John 1:1c, the nature of God is also the nature of the Logos, And in John 1:14, we see that the nature of flesh is what the Logos became. What are we to conclude from these two things? What we are to conclude from this is that that which was the nature of God became the nature of man. That which was the nature of God became the nature of man. Now you can see from these simple passages that we went over of just how mind-boggling Christ is, how amazing it is. The very creation that he upholds and sustains himself is also the creation that he enters into and redeems. And he enters into his own creation as light coming into darkness, as John 1 also says, so that he can save us and bring us redemption. What an amazing Savior. What an amazing God. Okay, this just shows how awesome and how big Christ is. All right. If your view of Christ is hostile or diminishes Christ from these amazing truths that John 1 shows us about him, then, my friends, you have a false gospel and you have a false religion, and you are not seeing Christ and you are not seeing God as he really is. So I encourage you to look at John 1:1 and to see the vastness and the beauty of Christ as he really is presented as being triune. Thank you guys so much for watching. Thank you so much for listening. Please use these arguments with Jehovah's Witnesses, Mormons, Muslims, and Unitarians, and then come back here and share with me in the comments how it went for you. I would really love to know. Thank you guys so much for watching. We'll see you next time. Take care.